Marcus Rodriguez never imagined that emptying trash cans in a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper would prepare him for the most important medical emergency of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When 15-year-old Sophia Chen suddenly collapsed in the marble atrium of NexTech Industries, speaking rapidly in Arabic as her body convulsed, every person in their expensive suits froze in panic. Every person except the night janitor who'd once saved lives in the deserts of Afghanistan. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus pushed his cleaning cart through the 37th floor of NexTech Industries at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October. The building stood as a testament to technological innovation, its glass walls reflecting the city lights like a beacon of corporate success. Inside these walls, CEO Amanda Chen commanded a software empire worth $3 billion, making decisions that influenced millions of users across the globe. But tonight, as Marcus methodically worked his way through each office, he had no idea that his past would collide with the present in the most unexpected way. The security cameras captured everything, though no one would review the footage until much later. Marcus moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to find purpose in routine work. Each motion deliberate, each task completed with quiet dignity. The other custodial staff knew him as reliable but reserved, a man who kept to himself and never complained about working the graveyard shift. What they didn't know was that Marcus chose these hours specifically because they allowed him to be home when his 8-year-old son Diego returned from school each afternoon. 3 floors below, Sophia Chen sat in the building's spacious lobby, her laptop balanced on her knees as she worked through advanced calculus problems that would challenge most college students. At 15, she possessed the kind of intellectual brilliance that opened doors to elite universities and promised a future of unlimited possibilities. Her mother's assistant had left her there hours ago with strict instructions to wait until the quarterly board meeting concluded, no matter how late it ran. This had become their routine, these long evenings in corporate spaces. While Amanda navigated the demands of leading a major technology company, Sophia's fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, solving equations that held no real meaning for her beyond their role as stepping stones toward the future her mother had carefully architected. The lobby's designer furniture surrounded her like an expensive cage, beautiful but cold, much like the relationship she shared with the woman whose approval she desperately craved but rarely received. The other teenagers in her accelerated program spent their evenings at movies or hanging out with friends, but Sophia had learned long ago that her life operated by different rules, governed by expectations that left little room for typical adolescent experiences. The first sign of trouble came at 11:52 p.m., though the security guard at the front desk was too absorbed in his phone to notice. Sophia's head began to feel light, a strange floating sensation that made the numbers on her screen blur together. She attributed it to fatigue from another 18-hour day that had begun with advanced Arabic lessons at dawn, continued through honors classes at the private academy, and stretched into evening tutoring sessions. Her mother believed that fluency in multiple languages would provide crucial advantages in global business, so Sophia had been studying Arabic intensively for the past 2 years. The second wave hit harder, a crushing pain behind her eyes that made her gasp audibly in the empty lobby. The laptop slipped from her hands, clattering against the marble floor as she gripped the leather chair's armrests. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but Sophia had been trained since childhood to handle problems independently, to never burden others with her struggles. She tried to stand, thinking fresh air might help, but her legs betrayed her, buckling as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. When Marcus heard the crash from 3 floors down, his instincts kicked in immediately. The sound of expensive electronics hitting marble was distinctive, sharp, and final in a way that suggested more than simple clumsiness. He abandoned his cart and headed toward the elevator bank, though he couldn't have explained why. Something in the building's atmosphere felt different, charged with the kind of tension he'd learned to recognize during his 2 tours in Afghanistan, where paying attention to subtle changes often meant the difference between life and death. The elevator seemed to descend with agonizing slowness, each floor number illuminating and fading as Marcus descended toward whatever crisis awaited below. His mind automatically cataloged the medical supplies available in the building's first aid stations, a habit developed during years of combat service where being prepared for medical emergencies was as natural as breathing. He'd left the military 3 years ago, but the training never truly left his system, lying dormant until moments like these when civilian life suddenly demanded military skills. The lobby doors opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Sophia lay unconscious on the marble floor, her body rigid with what Marcus immediately recognized as seizure activity. But what made his blood run cold was the sound coming from her lips, a stream of rapid Arabic that he understood perfectly, words describing pain and fear in a language she'd been learning for just 2 years. The security guard stood frozen 10 feet away, his phone in his hand as he tried to decide whether to call 911, while a late-working executive paced nearby, clearly out of his depth. Marcus dropped to his knees beside Sophia without hesitation, his hands moving with the swift certainty of someone who'd performed triage in far worse conditions. He checked her airway first, then her pulse, noting the rapid, thready heartbeat that suggested severe distress. The Arabic words continued to flow from her unconscious lips, but they weren't random. They were coherent expressions of specific symptoms that painted a clear picture for someone trained to listen. Marcus had spent months in Iraqi hospitals, working alongside local doctors, and learning to communicate medical information in Arabic, a skill he'd never expected to use in a Manhattan office building. Marcus positioned Sophia in the recovery position with practiced movements, his calloused hands gentle against her trembling form. The Arabic phrases spilling from her lips weren't the textbook sentences of a language student, but the desperate vocabulary of someone describing neurological symptoms with startling medical accuracy. She spoke of piercing lights behind her eyes, of electrical storms in her head, of feeling like her brain was disconnecting from her body. These weren't phrases any 15-year-old should know, yet here she was, articulating complex medical distress in a foreign language while completely unconscious. The security guard finally managed to dial 911, his voice shaking as he tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Marcus listened with half his attention while monitoring Sophia's vital signs, noting how her pulse had begun to stabilize but remained elevated. Her breathing was becoming more regular, though she continued speaking Arabic in fragments that suggested she was reliving medical experiences, describing procedures and symptoms with vocabulary far beyond her supposed proficiency level. Something about this didn't add up, and Marcus's trained instincts told him there were layers to this emergency that went deeper than a simple seizure. 28 floors above, Amanda Chen stood at the head of the boardroom table, completely unaware that her daughter lay unconscious in the lobby below. The Indoi Maichos quarterly presentation demanded her complete focus as she navigated hostile questions from investors concerned about market share and revenue projections. Her phone sat silenced in her briefcase, a deliberate choice to prevent any distractions during what could be the most crucial business meeting of the fiscal year. Amanda had built NexTech from a startup in her garage to a multi-billion-dollar corporation through unwavering focus and the ability to compartmentalize every aspect of her life, including her relationship with Sophia. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he knelt on the cold marble, providing medical care that Sophia's mother should have been there to witness. This wasn't the first time he'd seen the girl in the lobby during his evening rounds, though their interactions had been limited to polite nods and brief conversations about homework. Sophia was always alone during these late-night vigils, always waiting for board meetings or conference calls to conclude, always carrying herself with the resigned patience of someone far older than her 15 years. The expensive clothes and prestigious school uniform couldn't mask the isolation that seemed to follow her like a shadow. As Sophia's seizure subsided and her Arabic murmurs faded to whispers, Marcus began piecing together observations he'd accumulated over months of working in the building. The girl was brilliant, that much was obvious from the advanced textbooks she carried and the complex equations he'd glimpsed on her laptop screen. But there was something fragile about her brilliance, a quality that reminded him of soldiers he'd treated who carried invisible wounds alongside their visible ones. She moved through the corporate environment like someone navigating a minefield, always careful, always controlled, never quite relaxed enough to simply be a teenager. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their equipment clattering against the marble as they set up triage protocols. Marcus briefed them with military precision, reporting vital signs, seizure duration, and the unusual linguistic component of Sophia's episode. The lead paramedic, a woman named Jennifer with 20 years of emergency experience, raised an eyebrow when Marcus mentioned the Arabic symptoms description. That's not typical for someone her age, unless she has significant medical exposure or trauma history, Jennifer observed, while checking Sophia's pupils for responsiveness. Marcus stepped back to allow the medical team to work, but something nagged at him about the entire situation. During his military service, he'd encountered similar cases where young translators or civilians exposed to combat stress would experience neurological episodes triggered by linguistic switching between their native language and Arabic. The brain's language centers could become crossed during extreme stress, causing people to express distress in whatever language they associated with trauma or intense learning experiences. But Sophia was a privileged teenager from Manhattan, not a combat zone translator. The executive who'd been pacing nearby finally approached Marcus, introducing himself as Robert Hayes from the legal department. "You handled that incredibly well," Robert said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Are you trained in emergency medicine?" Marcus nodded briefly, not wanting to elaborate on his background while the situation remained unstable. "The military teaches you to respond quickly," he replied simply, though his mind was racing through possible explanations for Sophia's condition. As the paramedics prepared Sophia for transport, she began to regain consciousness, her eyes fluttering open with the confused disorientation common after seizures. The first words from her lips were in English, asking where she was and what had happened, but Marcus noticed how her gaze remained unfocused, as if she was still processing information from multiple languages simultaneously. When Jennifer asked her basic orientation questions, Sophia answered correctly but with noticeable delay, as though translating her thoughts before speaking. The ambulance departed with lights flashing but no sirens, indicating Sophia's condition had stabilized enough to avoid emergency protocols. Marcus watched from the lobby windows as the vehicle disappeared into the late-night traffic, carrying away a young woman whose life had just intersected with his in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The security guard was already on the phone with building management, reporting the incident with bureaucratic efficiency that reduced a human crisis to administrative details, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's emergency was a symptom of something much larger. In his 3 years working at NexTech, he had observed the corporate culture that prioritized productivity over personal well-being, where employees regularly worked 16-hour days, and executives measured their worth by their ability to sacrifice everything for professional success. Sophia had been raised in this environment, shaped by expectations that would challenge adults, let alone a teenager still developing her sense of identity and purpose. The building felt different as Marcus returned to his cleaning duties, the earlier emergency having shifted something fundamental in the atmosphere. He found himself thinking about his own son Diego, 8 years old and completely unaware of the pressures that came with exceptional intelligence and ambitious parents. Diego spent his evenings playing with neighborhood kids, struggling with third-grade math, and asking innocent questions about why the sky was blue. The contrast with Sophia's regimented existence was stark and troubling. Marcus had chosen his current job specifically because it allowed him to prioritize Diego's needs over career advancement. After losing his wife Maria to cancer 2 years earlier, he'd restructured his entire life around being present for his son's childhood. The janitorial work paid enough to cover their modest apartment in Queens and Diego's school expenses, while the night shift ensured Marcus was always home when Diego returned from school. It wasn't the life he'd imagined during his military service, but it was the life his son needed. The more Marcus thought about tonight's incident, the more questions arose about Sophia's medical history and the circumstances that had led to such an unusual presentation. The Arabic language component suggested either intensive study under stressful conditions or exposure to trauma in contexts where Arabic was the primary language. Given her mother's position and the family's obvious wealth, neither explanation seemed immediately obvious, yet the evidence was undeniable. As he worked through the upper floors, Marcus found himself wondering about Amanda Chen's parenting philosophy and whether she had any awareness of her daughter's apparent distress. The corporate world demanded a certain level of emotional detachment, but families required the opposite, authentic connection and vulnerability that many successful executives struggled to provide. Marcus had seen this pattern during his military service, where high-ranking officers who could command thousands of soldiers sometimes failed completely at communicating with their own children. The building's silence felt heavier now, filled with the weight of unspoken pressures and unrealistic expectations. Somewhere in this glass tower, a brilliant teenager was learning to navigate a world that demanded perfection, while providing little emotional support for the inevitable moments when perfection proved impossible. And somewhere else, a mother was making decisions about market strategies and profit margins, while remaining completely unaware that her daughter had just experienced a medical emergency that revealed deep psychological stress. Marcus finished his rounds with unusual contemplation, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and that tonight's emergency was likely just the beginning of a much more complex story. The intersection of his military medical training with Sophia's crisis felt like more than coincidence, though he couldn't yet see the full pattern that was emerging. What he did know was that a young woman needed help, and sometimes help came from the most unexpected sources, even if it meant a janitor with combat experience would have to step forward when others stepped back. 3 days after the seizure incident, Marcus received an unexpected phone call during his lunch break. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Mount Sinai Hospital, and her tone carried the careful professionalism of someone delivering sensitive medical information. "Mr. Rodriguez," she began, "Sophia Chen has been asking to speak with you specifically. She's been quite insistent that you were the person who helped her during her episode, and she claims you understood what she was saying in Arabic. Would you be willing to visit during her recovery period?" The request caught Marcus off guard, though not as much as Dr. Mitchell's next statement. Sophia has been experiencing what we're calling linguistic displacement episodes. When she's under extreme stress, her brain switches to Arabic for expressing medical or emotional distress, but she describes symptoms and experiences that far exceed her supposed 2 years of academic study. The vocabulary she's using suggests exposure to medical trauma or intensive clinical experiences. We're hoping you might have insights into what triggered this particular episode. Marcus agreed to visit that evening, but Dr. Mitchell's words haunted him throughout his remaining work hours. Linguistic displacement wasn't uncommon among combat veterans or refugees who'd experienced trauma in multilingual environments, but finding it in a 15-year-old American student suggested circumstances that didn't align with Sophia's apparent privileged background. As he completed his cleaning rounds, Marcus found himself mentally reviewing Arabic medical terminology, wondering how a teenager could possibly have acquired such specialized vocabulary. The pediatric wing at Mount Sinai felt different from the military hospitals Marcus remembered, softer somehow but carrying the same underlying tension of people fighting battles they might not win. Sophia occupied a private room on the 7th floor, surrounded by monitoring equipment that beeped quietly in the background. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, more vulnerable than she'd appeared during their brief encounters in the NexTech lobby. When she saw Marcus enter, her expression shifted from the polite distance he'd grown accustomed to, revealing something closer to genuine relief. "Thank you for coming," Sophia said, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed both natural and forced. "The doctors keep asking me about my Arabic studies, but I can't explain how I know the words I've been saying. You understood me though, didn't you? When I was talking about the pain behind my eyes, about feeling like electricity was moving through my brain, you knew what I meant." Marcus pulled up the visitor's chair, choosing his words carefully. "Your Arabic is remarkably advanced for someone who's only studied for 2 years. Some of the medical terminology you used would challenge native speakers." Sophia's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for days. "That's what everyone keeps saying, but I don't remember learning those words. It's like they come from somewhere else in my mind, somewhere I can't reach when I'm awake. When the seizures start, everything switches to Arabic, and I can describe exactly what's happening to my body, but I've never been taught those specific terms. The doctors think I'm hiding something, but I honestly don't understand how I know what I know." Marcus studied her face, recognizing the confusion and fear that came with experiencing symptoms beyond one's control or understanding. During his military service, he'd worked with young interpreters who'd developed similar linguistic cross-wiring after exposure to medical emergencies and combat stress. But those cases involved direct trauma experience, not academic language learning. Something about Sophia's situation didn't align with conventional explanations, and his instincts told him there were missing pieces to her story. Dr. Mitchell entered the room carrying a thick medical file and introduced herself to Marcus with professional courtesy. She'd clearly researched his background because her questions were pointed and specific. "Mr. Rodriguez, your military records indicate extensive field medical training and experience working with Arabic-speaking patients in combat zones. Have you encountered similar cases of linguistic displacement in stress situations?" Marcus nodded, though he was curious about how she'd accessed his service records so quickly. The conversation that followed revealed the true scope of Sophia's condition. Her seizures weren't random medical events, but appeared to be triggered by specific stressors related to academic or social pressure. More disturbing was the pattern of her Arabic episodes, which consistently involved medical vocabulary that suggested exposure to traumatic medical experiences. Dr. Mitchell had consulted with neurologists and psychiatrists, but none could explain how a teenager with no apparent trauma history could possess such specialized knowledge. Sophia herself provided the key to understanding when she mentioned something that made Marcus's blood run cold. She described recurring dreams where she was translating for doctors treating injured children, helping medical teams communicate with Arabic-speaking patients in what appeared to be a war zone or disaster area. In these dreams, she possessed fluency that exceeded her waking abilities, understanding complex medical discussions and serving as a crucial link between desperate families and overwhelmed medical staff. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that Sophia had begun researching whether it was possible to inherit memories or linguistic abilities from previous generations. Her maternal grandmother had immigrated from Lebanon in the 1960s, speaking Arabic fluently, but had died when Amanda was still a child. The family had no other connections to Arabic-speaking communities or cultures, making Sophia's advanced vocabulary even more mysterious. Marcus felt a chill of recognition as Sophia described her dream scenarios. The details she provided, the specific medical procedures and emergency protocols, the chaos and desperation of treating casualties under impossible conditions, all matched his own experiences in military field hospitals. But how could a sheltered teenager from Manhattan be accessing memories that belonged to combat medics and battlefield surgeons? Dr. Mitchell shared additional information that deepened the mystery. Sophia's brain scans revealed unusual neural activity in areas associated with language processing and traumatic memory formation, but there was no evidence of direct head trauma or neurological disease. The pattern suggested that her brain was somehow accessing linguistic and experiential information that shouldn't exist in her personal memory banks. The medical team was considering rare neurological conditions, but none explained the specific Arabic medical vocabulary she demonstrated during episodes. The breakthrough came when Sophia mentioned something she'd never told the doctors or her mother. During her most severe seizures, she experienced what she described as borrowed memories, detailed recollections of medical emergencies where she served as a translator between Arabic-speaking patients and English-speaking medical teams. The memories were so intense and realistic that she could smell antiseptic, hear the sounds of medical equipment, and feel the pressure of life-or-death translation work. Marcus realized with growing certainty that Sophia wasn't experiencing inherited memories or supernatural phenomena. Her symptoms suggested something far more disturbing and entirely human. Someone had deliberately exposed her to intensive Arabic medical training under conditions stressful enough to create traumatic associations with the language. The question was who had done this and why, and how they'd managed to hide such extensive preparation from everyone in Sophia's life, including her mother. The conversation took on new urgency when Dr. Mitchell revealed that Amanda Chen had been notably absent during her daughter's hospitalization. The CEO had visited once briefly, but had spent most of the time taking business calls in the hallway rather than sitting with Sophia. When medical staff attempted to discuss her daughter's condition and the mysterious Arabic component, Amanda had deflected questions and insisted that Sophia's language studies were completely normal and supervised by qualified tutors. Marcus began connecting dots that painted a disturbing picture. Sophia's after-school schedule included private tutoring sessions that her mother arranged directly, bypassing the school's normal language programs. These sessions occurred at locations away from both home and school, and Sophia had never been allowed to discuss the specific teaching methods or curriculum with anyone else. What Amanda had presented as accelerated language learning might actually have been something far more sinister. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow when he remembered overhearing conversations between security guards about NexTech's government contracts. The company had recently secured major deals involving translation software for military and intelligence applications. Amanda Chen had been developing technology that required extensive testing with native Arabic speakers and complex medical terminology. The timing of Sophia's language studies coincided perfectly with her mother's need for advanced Arabic linguistic data. Sophia had been used as a test subject for her mother's translation technology, exposed to intensive Arabic medical training that created traumatic stress responses. The seizures weren't random neurological events, but psychological breaks triggered by the pressure of serving as an unwilling research participant in her mother's corporate projects. Amanda Chen hadn't been developing language skills in her daughter. She'd been exploiting her for business purposes while disguising the abuse as educational enrichment. Marcus looked at Sophia with new understanding, seeing not just a privileged teenager struggling with academic pressure, but a victim of systematic exploitation by the person who should have protected her most. The Arabic medical vocabulary hadn't come from textbooks or classroom instruction, but from forced participation in translation scenarios involving real medical emergencies, possibly recorded video sessions or simulation exercises designed to test translation software under stressful conditions. The scope of the deception was staggering. Amanda Chen had built her technology empire partly through the exploitation of her own daughter, using Sophia's developing brain as a testing ground for linguistic software, while maintaining the facade of educational excellence. The long hours in the NexTech lobby weren't just about busy board meetings. They were about maintaining proximity to ongoing research projects that required Sophia's involuntary participation. Dr. Mitchell's expression grew grave as Marcus shared his suspicions about Sophia's true experiences. The medical evidence supported the theory of induced trauma through forced linguistic training, and the specific nature of her Arabic medical vocabulary suggested exposure to genuine emergency scenarios rather than academic study. What they'd initially considered a mysterious neurological condition was actually the predictable result of sustained psychological abuse disguised as educational opportunity. Sophia listened to their conversation with growing horror and recognition, finally understanding why her Arabic abilities felt foreign and traumatic rather than learned and familiar. The borrowed memories weren't supernatural phenomena, but suppressed recollections of being forced to serve as a translator in high-stress medical scenarios, probably video simulations or virtual reality experiences designed to test her mother's software under realistic conditions. Her teenage brain had protected itself by compartmentalizing these experiences, but the seizures were breakthrough moments when the suppressed trauma overwhelmed her psychological defenses. The confrontation came sooner than Marcus anticipated. Amanda Chen arrived at Mount Sinai Hospital the following morning, with her usual entourage of assistants and legal advisors, her presence transforming the quiet pediatric ward into a whirlwind of corporate efficiency. She swept into Sophia's room like a force of nature, immediately beginning to orchestrate her daughter's discharge with the same commanding authority she used to run board meetings. The medical staff found themselves relegated to supporting roles in what appeared to be a carefully choreographed performance, designed to minimize exposure and control the narrative. Marcus was finishing his visit when Amanda arrived, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees as mother and daughter locked eyes. There was no warmth in the reunion, no relief or maternal concern visible in Amanda's perfectly composed expression. Instead, she regarded Sophia with the calculating assessment of a CEO evaluating an underperforming asset, her gaze cold and clinical as she processed the implications of her daughter's hospitalization and the questions it had raised among medical staff. Dr. Mitchell attempted to brief Amanda on Sophia's condition and the unusual aspects of her linguistic episodes, but the CEO cut her off with practiced efficiency. "My daughter has always been an exceptional student with advanced language abilities. These episodes are clearly the result of academic stress and overwork, which we'll address through appropriate rest and modified scheduling. I appreciate your medical care, but I believe the underlying causes are educational rather than neurological, and we'll handle them through proper academic counseling." The dismissive tone and obvious deflection confirmed Marcus's suspicions about Amanda's involvement in Sophia's condition. He watched as the powerful executive deployed corporate damage control tactics to shut down medical inquiry, using her wealth and influence to reframe her daughter's trauma as a simple case of academic pressure. The legal advisors took notes while Amanda spoke, clearly preparing to limit liability and prevent further investigation into the circumstances that had led to Sophia's seizures. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "Mrs. Chen," he interrupted, stepping forward with the quiet confidence he developed during military service, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what's really happening with Sophia's Arabic training. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the janitor who dared to challenge one of Manhattan's most powerful executives. Amanda's expression shifted from dismissive indifference to sharp attention as she registered the implicit threat in his words. The legal team immediately moved to assert control over the situation, with the lead attorney beginning to question Marcus's qualifications and authority to comment on medical matters. But Dr. Mitchell intervened, explaining that Marcus had military medical training and had been the first responder during Sophia's initial episode. His observations about her Arabic medical vocabulary had been crucial in understanding the nature of her condition, and his insights could be valuable in developing an appropriate treatment plan. Amanda Chen studied Marcus with the calculating intensity she reserved for hostile takeover negotiations and competitive threats. She clearly recognized that he represented a potential exposure to her carefully constructed facade, someone with enough knowledge and credibility to challenge her version of events. The corporate executive who could intimidate senators and corporate rivals found herself facing a night janitor who possessed information that could destroy everything she'd built. Marcus met her gaze steadily, drawing on the same calm determination that had carried him through combat situations where lives hung in the balance. "Mrs. Chen, your daughter has been experiencing symptoms consistent with forced linguistic training under traumatic conditions. The Arabic medical vocabulary she's demonstrating isn't the result of normal academic study. Someone has deliberately exposed her to high-stress translation scenarios involving real medical emergencies, creating psychological trauma that manifests as seizures when she's under pressure." The accusation hung in the air like an unexploded device, its implications reverberating through the room as everyone processed what Marcus had just suggested. Sophia's eyes widened with recognition and growing understanding, finally seeing her experiences described in terms that made sense of her confusion and distress. The borrowed memories, the traumatic associations with Arabic medical terminology, the seizures triggered by academic stress, all of it aligned with Marcus's explanation of systematic exploitation disguised as educational enhancement. Amanda's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing a flash of the ruthless calculation that had built her empire through questionable means. But she recovered quickly, deploying the same strategic thinking that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in the technology sector. "Mr. Rodriguez, these are serious accusations that you're making without any supporting evidence. My daughter receives the finest educational opportunities available, and I resent the implication that her academic achievements are somehow the result of inappropriate methods." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with medical authority that even Amanda's legal team couldn't dismiss. "Mrs. Chen, the neurological evidence supports Mr. Rodriguez's assessment. Sophia's brain scans show patterns consistent with traumatic stress responses, specifically in areas associated with forced linguistic processing under high-pressure conditions. Her Arabic medical vocabulary far exceeds what could be achieved through normal academic study, suggesting exposure to genuine medical emergency scenarios rather than classroom instruction." The medical evidence combined with Marcus's first-hand observations created a compelling case that Amanda couldn't simply dismiss through corporate maneuvering. Her legal advisors exchanged worried glances as they realized the potential implications for both civil liability and criminal charges related to child exploitation. The same translation technology that had made NexTech billions of dollars in government contracts had apparently been developed through the systematic abuse of the CEO's own daughter. Sophia found her voice for the first time since her mother's arrival, speaking with a clarity that cut through the legal and medical jargon surrounding her case. "Mom," she said quietly, "I remember some of it now. The virtual reality sessions where I had to translate for injured soldiers. The recordings of real medical emergencies where people were dying and I had to help doctors understand what patients were saying. You told me it was advanced language training, but it was your software testing, wasn't it? You used me to make your translation programs work better." The admission from Sophia herself demolished Amanda's defensive strategy, providing direct testimony about the exploitation that had caused her psychological trauma. The powerful executive who'd built an empire through strategic manipulation found herself cornered by her own daughter's honesty and a janitor's medical expertise. There was no corporate spin that could reframe the systematic abuse of a minor for commercial purposes, no legal strategy that could transform child exploitation into educational excellence. Marcus pressed his advantage with the methodical approach he'd learned during military interrogations of enemy combatants. "Mrs. Chen, your government contracts for military translation software required extensive testing with Arabic medical terminology Sophia's training sessions coincided perfectly with your development timeline for those projects. You needed a test subject who could provide linguistic data under stressful conditions, and you used your own daughter rather than hiring professional translators or adult volunteers. Amanda's legal team attempted damage control, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the implications were devastating for both NexTech's government contracts and Amanda's personal reputation. The revelation that a major defense contractor had developed military software through child exploitation would trigger investigations by multiple federal agencies, not to mention the civil liability for the systematic abuse of a minor. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Amanda finally abandoned her corporate facade and revealed the cold calculation that had driven her actions. Everything I did was to secure Sophia's future. The translation technology will be worth hundreds of millions in military contracts, ensuring generational wealth that will protect her from any possible hardship. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions that others don't understand, sacrificing short-term comfort for long-term security. Marcus stared at her with the same disgust he'd felt for enemy combatants who justified atrocities through strategic necessity. You sacrificed your daughter's mental health for profit margins. You caused psychological trauma that will affect her for the rest of her life, all to develop software that makes your company more money. That's not leadership, Mrs. Chen. That's exploitation. And it's exactly the kind of abuse I spent years fighting against overseas. Dr. Mitchell made the decision that ended Amanda's control over the situation, informing hospital security that she was placing Sophia under protective custody, pending investigation by Child Protective Services. The medical evidence of systematic psychological abuse was sufficient to override parental authority, especially given the ongoing risk of continued exploitation. Amanda's legal team exploded into action, threatening lawsuits and demanding immediate discharge. But medical professionals had clear authority to protect minors from abusive situations. Sophia watched her mother's empire begin to crumble with a mixture of relief and sadness, finally understanding that her years of confusion and trauma had been the result of deliberate exploitation rather than personal inadequacy. The seizures and Arabic episodes weren't signs of her own failure but evidence of systematic abuse that would have broken most adults, let alone a developing teenager. For the first time in years, she felt like someone understood what she'd experienced and was willing to protect her from further harm. Marcus stayed with Sophia as Child Protective Services arrived to begin their investigation, providing the steady presence of someone who understood both the trauma she'd experienced and the courage required to survive it. His military training had taught him to recognize victims of systematic abuse, and his own experience as a father gave him insight into the profound betrayal represented by Amanda's actions. What had started as a medical emergency in a corporate lobby had evolved into a criminal investigation that would reshape multiple lives. The powerful executive who'd commanded billions of dollars in assets found herself facing federal investigations, criminal charges, and the complete destruction of everything she'd built through the exploitation of her own child. Marcus, a night janitor with combat medical training, had become the catalyst for justice simply by recognizing trauma when he saw it and refusing to let corporate power silence the truth about systematic abuse disguised as educational opportunity. 6 months later, Marcus walked through the corridors of Mount Sinai's Youth Rehabilitation Center, no longer wearing a janitor's uniform but dressed in the simple clothes of someone who'd found his true calling. The federal investigation into NexTech had resulted in Amanda Chen's conviction on multiple charges of child exploitation and fraud, with her company's government contracts permanently revoked. But more importantly for Marcus, it had led to an unexpected opportunity to return to work that actually mattered. Dr. Mitchell had recommended Marcus for a position developing trauma therapy programs for adolescents who'd experienced systematic abuse. His unique combination of military medical training and personal understanding of how corporate power could destroy innocent lives made him ideally suited for helping young victims rebuild their sense of safety and self-worth. The pay was modest compared to his previous career prospects, but the work provided meaning that no amount of money could replace. Sophia had become his first success story, though her healing journey remained ongoing and complex. The teenager who'd once suffered seizures triggered by Arabic medical terminology now used her linguistic abilities to help other young trauma survivors communicate their experiences to therapists and medical professionals. Her fluency, gained through such painful circumstances, had been transformed into a tool for healing rather than exploitation. She developed remarkable resilience, channeling her intelligence toward helping others rather than simply achieving academic excellence. The relationship between Marcus and Sophia had evolved into something resembling the bond between mentor and student, though their connection went deeper than professional therapy. She often visited his apartment in Queens, where Diego treated her like the older sister he'd never had. The three of them had created an unconventional family unit, bound together by shared understanding of loss and the importance of genuine human connection over material success. Diego thrived under the influence of both Marcus's steady presence and Sophia's intellectual curiosity. The 8-year-old had developed confidence and academic enthusiasm that came from being valued for his authentic self, rather than pressured to meet impossible expectations. Watching his son laugh and play with the natural joy of childhood reminded Marcus daily of what really mattered in life and what was worth protecting. Amanda Chen had been sentenced to federal prison, where she would spend the next 8 years contemplating the difference between success and fulfillment. Her corporate empire had collapsed under the weight of criminal investigation, but perhaps more devastatingly, she'd lost the relationship with her daughter that no amount of wealth could restore. Sophia visited occasionally, not out of forgiveness, but from a mature understanding that healing sometimes required facing the source of pain directly. Marcus often reflected on how a single moment of medical emergency had revealed the interconnected nature of human suffering and redemption. His decision to step forward when others stepped back had not only saved Sophia's life but had shown him that heroism often looked like simply being present when someone needed help. The combat medic skills he'd thought were no longer relevant had proved essential in a civilian crisis that required both medical expertise and moral courage. The work continued, one young person at a time, one family learning to heal from systematic trauma. Marcus had discovered that his true mission wasn't conquering foreign battlefields, but helping people win the wars they fought within themselves. And in the quiet moments between therapy sessions, watching Diego play while Sophia worked on her college applications, he knew he'd finally found the purpose that military service had only prepared him to fulfill. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.